I'm Charlie Jardino, Clerk of Court of St. Landry Parish. I've been in this job since 1992, and it's been my pleasure to serve the people of St. Landry Parish as their clerk. One of the favorite parts of my job is the archives and the responsibilities and the opportunities that go along with taking care of the archives of such an old parish. We were part of Imperial St. Landry Parish when it was created. And so we have records that go way back to the 1700s. Matter of fact, this courthouse was completed in 1941, but the first courthouse was built here in about 1920, and I'm sorry, 1837. There was also a structure here in 1806. 1820, it burned down, and it burned down again in 1939. That's when the present courthouse was built. Fortunately, the records were kept in an outbuilding and they weren't lost. So we have records all the way back to the colonial period. The first clerk here was Judge Lee, and he served as a clerk from 1805 to 1807. He became the parish probate judge from 1807 and he served until 1842. Our colonial records cover a period of 1764 to 1803. They're on microfilm here and available on microfilm, and they're also at the state archives. The notarial records span the time period of 1820 to 1850, and the first parish recorder was here in 1845. We have records that are imaged and indexed in various periods from the 1800s to present, and in mid 2015 we should have a constant record that's imaged and indexed and available online from 1800 to the present day. We're pretty proud of that, and it should be completed early next year. I'd like to introduce our archivist, a former archivist who's retired now, Mr. Keith Fontenot, and he can expand on what I've told you about our records here in St. Landry Parish. Thank you.
To continue, again, this is not an exact science, but rather an art. It's basically the detective work. You have to be persistent. You have to sit down, think, and critically analyze what do you have. Case in point, as I said previously, let's talk about the Fontenot family, since that's my surname. Again, you have the standard English spelling of F-O-N-T-E-N-O-T. Earlier in the 18th century, it was F-O-N-T-E-N-E-A-U or N-E-A-U-X. Again, the family originally traces its ancestry back to Alabama, then to Poitou and Anjou and the Loire Valley in France. What is interesting with the family is that you also have clan names as well, or tribal names, as well as the surnames. For instance, with the Fontenots, you have Belair Fontenots, Manuel Fontenots, LaRose Fontenots. Also with the Fusiliers, you have the Valerial, you have the Boulous, and the Pekins. So you had many individuals with the same name, but they normally would try to put their identity with their local clan name. Um, Again, this basically goes back to the Romans, where you had the given name, the last name, and also the clan name too. And in some ways, that over the years transferred to the records in South Louisiana. Unlike our northern neighbors, here you have more than one language to contend with. There's also the case where Mr. Lejeune sells property to his son, Mr. Young. Or William Janson could sell land to his son, Mr. Johnson. So again, there's a play between English, French, Spanish, and phonetic spellings that have to be dealt with. Case of what a researcher would be dealing with, I have several documents here on the table in front of me. Here we have an original document from 1840. Again, it's written in French, and again, you have the original signatures of the parties and also the notary. Again, Louisiana is the only state in the Union that keeps the originals as well as the copybooks. In other states, the clerk would just have the clerk's copy in the book, and the purchaser would have the original. But again, Louisiana, due to Spanish notarial history, has always maintained the originals as well as the copybook. And if you would take a look at this document, it's basically a land sale from a Cyprien Foray or Forrest to a Josephine Fusilier, who is the spouse of Cyprien Foray. This seems to be a d'achat en paiement, whereby he squandered his wife's separate property. And by Spanish law, which was later incorporated into the Louisiana civil law, the wife had a tacit mortgage on all of her husband's property. If he would squander her separate property, he would have to make restitution. Again, it could be in the form of livestock, slaves, land, but again, women property rights were better protected in Louisiana than in the English common law states. You had certain individual women that conducted business. I can think of Manon Baldwin, who was a free woman of color, who had a establishment across from the courthouse on the corner of Landry and Court. There was also Marie Therese Castile, who had married Mr. Estorge, and then later married Pierre Labiche, who subsequently dies about 1850 in New Orleans. And these individuals are women, and they are conducting business. So it was basically not just the prerogative of the husband. The wife or the widow, had a say and a stake in property, money, and assets. This is what an original would look like. This would have been filed with the clerk of court's office, and then they would have the copybook. A copy would have been made of this document and then indexed. So if there was any, doubt concerning the copybook, you always had the original to fall back upon. What we have here in this book is articles of co-partnerships between William Hasselett and Leonard Claiborne and William Reed to establish a tannery to tan hides. Now, this reflects the early cattle industry in St. Landry Parish. You did ship livestock to New Orleans, but at the same time, you would also tan hides, also grow cotton, sugar cane, and this would basically be shipped from Old Church Landing or what is now the town of Washington down by Yucatala by steamer, which the steamboat started about 1826 in the southern and southwestern part of Louisiana. If you're interested in steamboats, there's a recent work put out by the LSU Press by Carl Brasso and myself, Steamboats in the Louisiana Bayous. It's interesting how some individuals in St. Landry Parish tried to get a monopoly to conduct the steamboat business from the state legislature, but again, it was ultimately determined in one lawsuit that the U.S. Customs Office had the final say in which steamer could come up the bayous and that. But to get back to the individual who is looking for ancestors, you have the marriage records, you have the probates or the estates, which are important in a very large aspect, whereby this puts basically meat on the skeleton. You find out who the surviving widow or widower was, the children. There was usually a family meeting where relatives would get together and with the court's guidance would look after the interests of the minors. You also had the appraisal. What did they own? Then later you had the sale of these assets. And this does give you an eye into what these people were concerned with. Again, putting food on the table, living without electricity, medical technology that was not that great. You were not that far removed where a barber would not only cut your hair, but they would also bleed you. So, sometimes you were in a worse condition going to a physician And a lot of these individuals would, turn to home medicines and herbs that apparently, were used over the centuries in that. I would like to add an additional footnote is that the documents that are deposited within the Clerk of Courts archives reflect the parish and the different individuals who lived at certain points in time. The earlier records reflect a different mindset. People were, for the most part, close to subsistence agriculture, that one bad crop could really put an individual in peril. But again, they were living normally with the extended family. So you went to your grandfather, your brother, your uncle for support or aid. This is something that really continued up into the 1950s. I remember personally, as a child, witnessing the neighborhood butchering of cattle in the summer and, hogs in the winter, the making of boudin, sausage, cracklings, and so forth. So the first prerequisite that our ancestors were concerned with was to be sure there was food on the table. And again, present day individuals do not recognize how much effort it took to basically to survive. Electricity, refrigeration has really changed the landscape. I remember at my grandmother's, if you wanted fried chicken, you went to the chicken coop and wrung the chicken's neck, and then you continued from there. So the parish records, in a lot of ways, will reflect what is important. It's a mirror, it's a window into a different age and time. Case in point, 1901 is when you really have your first oil, gas, and mineral leases that come into the forefront. Prior to that, if you had oil on your land, say in 1815, you didn't have much use for it. Again, the tax rolls of 1818 reflect what a person owned. Was it first quality soil, second or third quality? First quality was probably the alluvial soils around Port Barre and the beginning of the Mississippi Valley that were very rich and very productive. Second quality could have been the open prairie. Third quality could have been marshy areas or the piney woods. Again, you paid a certain tax for the value that was assessed. You paid tax on each slave, horned cattle, horses and mules. And if you were a lawyer or a physician, or if you owned a two-wheel or four-wheel carriage, you paid an additional tax. And also, if you owned a billiard table, you paid an additional tax. What is interesting too is that you do have these bonds to the governor, normally in the amount of $500. They are basically stating that an individual, say, John Smith is the owner of a certain saloon, barroom, or garage shop. You had to keep it in an orderly fashion and maintain a certain standard prescribed by statutory law, or you could forfeit the bond. So as time changes, the records also will change. They will reflect the coming of the petroleum industry. Land that had been basically marginal, not of much value, all of a sudden became priceless. Again, technology was really the driving force, and people do not realize that when the humans entered the 19th century, they were going 6 miles an hour in a horse and buggy. By the 20th century, they were going 60 miles an hour by train, and by the 21st century, 600 miles by jet. And does it follow that you will be going even faster in the 22nd century? The Industrial Revolution was basically about 175 years. When Jefferson takes office in 1801, a man on horseback is still the fastest form of land conveyance. A sailing ship is still the technology. Flintlock pistols and rifles were also in use. Those date back to about 1625. And then there's a change in 1830 when there is the invention of the percussion cap. And then it seems to literally explode. So you have oil, gas, and mineral that will come to the forefront. Then you have highways, rights of ways for transportation. Later, you will have rights of ways for power lines, pipelines, and so forth. Again, depicting the evolution, the technology that mankind has been dealing with. And it seems like it's not going to slow down anytime soon. So what people should realize when they're trying to trace their ancestry is that your ancestor had a different mindset, a different world. Their focus was basically introspective. They were in an extended family, a small community, and they did not travel that far from their original birthplace. And again, they were very clannish in a lot of ways, and they knew, their individual neighbors and so forth very well, and they depended upon each other, and that was the key to the survival and also to the prosperity that they, through their hard work, laid for future generations.